When Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in modern history, walked into courtroom 12B of the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Washington, everyone could tell that something was about to break. Flanked by no legal team, no entourage, no flashy lawyer in a $1,000 suit. Just her, a navy blazer, a spiral-bound notebook, and a calmness that looked, at best, naive. The mood was electric. Judge Miriam Hallbridge, a woman known for her razor wit and zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, barely concealed her amusement. "You're representing yourself, Miss Leavitt?" Karoline stood tall. "Yes, Your Honor." The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge shook her head. "Let the record reflect. The defendant has declined counsel." She leaned back, smirking. "This should be interesting," she said with disdain written all over her. Well, watch to the end, because what happened next in that courtroom didn't just shake Washington, it tore open the veil on a system built on fear. The government was accusing Karoline of obstruction of justice and unauthorized release of classified documents, a career-ending scandal for most. The press had already written her obituary. But what no one in that courtroom knew, not the prosecution, not the reporters, and certainly not Judge Hallbridge, was that Karoline Leavitt had been preparing for this moment for months. Not to survive, to win. And by the time the judge banged her gavel for the final time, she would no longer be laughing. She would be speechless. Because the young woman standing alone at the defense table wasn't just a press secretary, she was a legal genius in disguise. Judge Miriam Hallbridge banged her gavel 3 times, the sharp crack echoing through courtroom 12B like a warning shot. The room fell silent. "The court is now in session," she said, her voice brisk and clipped, like a woman with no time for nonsense. "Case number 24, CR 9017, United States of America versus Karoline Leavitt." A wave of anticipation passed through the gallery. Reporters shifted forward in their seats, pens at the ready. Camera crews jostled behind the glass, capturing the image of a woman the political world had all but written off. Karoline Leavitt sat alone at the defense table, her back straight, eyes locked forward. She wore a simple navy suit, no designer accessories, no makeup beyond the bare minimum. Her hands rested atop a worn notebook filled with handwritten tabs, color-coded with sticky notes, ink smudged from weeks, maybe months, of late-night study sessions. Judge Hallbridge scanned the room, pausing when she saw Karoline was seated alone. "No counsel with you today, Ms. Leavitt?" she asked, tilting her head. Karoline stood calm and steady. "That's correct, Your Honor. I'll be representing myself." "Bold move. I assume you've read at least one book on federal criminal procedure?" The judge fired back. "A few," Karoline replied, her tone respectful but firm. "And a few hundred cases." Hallbridge blinked. For a brief second she seemed caught off guard before the smirk returned. Well then, this should be entertaining. At the prosecution table, U.S. Attorney Daniel Kravitz tried to hide his grin. He leaned toward his co-counsel, whispering just loud enough for the microphones to catch it. "She's gonna get shredded." Karoline heard it. She didn't react. Judge Hallbridge turned to Kravitz. "Mr. Kravitz, your opening statement, please." He rose smoothly, tugging at his perfectly tailored gray suit. He spoke like a man who had done this 1,000 times and never lost. His voice was crisp, polished, as if practiced in front of a mirror. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court, the facts here are not in dispute," he began, pacing with ease. "Ms. Leavitt, a former federal employee, knowingly and willfully disseminated classified documents to unauthorized third parties. She then obstructed the subsequent investigation by deleting communications and refusing to comply with subpoenas." He turned toward the gallery, making eye contact with the press. This is not a case about ideology. This is about accountability, about consequences. Judge Halbridge nodded. Thank you, Mr. Kravitz. Ms. Leavitt, your opening. Karoline stood slowly, holding only a single page of notes. She walked to the center of the courtroom, heels clicking against the marble floor. I'm not here today because I'm guilty, she began. I'm here because I told the truth, and powerful people didn't like it. Her voice was lower than Kravitz's, softer, but every syllable carried weight. I didn't leak classified documents. I exposed corruption. What I released was evidence of political interference in a federal agency, evidence the American people had every right to see. And the so-called obstruction? I followed every legal channel available until they shut every one of them down. She looked directly at the judge. This case isn't about law. It's about silencing dissent. Judge Halbridge narrowed her eyes, but said nothing. Kravitz looked amused. Well rehearsed, he whispered. The first witness was called, a mid-level intelligence analyst named Gordon Vexler. He wore a government-issued suit and spoke in clipped, memorized sentences. Yes, I reviewed the security logs. Yes, the files in question were downloaded from a restricted server. Yes, the credentials used belonged to Ms. Leavitt. On the surface, it seemed damning. Karoline listened attentively, jotting notes in the margins of her paper, occasionally underlining something. Her eyes flicked to the courtroom clock. Her face showed no fear, no doubt. Then something odd happened. As Vexler droned on, Halbridge's gaze drifted to Karoline again. She expected her to be fidgeting, sweating, unraveling. She wasn't. Karoline sat like someone who had already seen the ending to the movie and was just waiting for the rest of the audience to catch up. Something about that unnerved the judge. Just a flicker. But it was there, and it would grow. The courtroom doors creaked shut behind Gordon Vexler as he stepped down from the witness stand, his testimony finished. Kravitz looked satisfied. The judge made a quick note on her legal pad, then looked up. We'll reconvene tomorrow at 9 o'clock a.m., Judge Halbridge said, her voice dry and matter-of-fact. Court is adjourned. The gavel cracked once, sending a ripple through the gallery. People began to rise. Cameras flashed behind the glass, capturing Karoline as she calmly gathered her notes. Alone at the defense table, she looked striking not because of what she wore or how she moved, but because of how unaffected she seemed. No one had expected her to last a day. Judge Halbridge removed her robe in her chambers and tossed it across the back of her leather chair. She stared out the window for a moment, sipping from her chipped, I survived law school mug. Something gnawed at her. Karoline Leavitt. The girl had poise. That much was clear. But where was the fear? The desperation? It wasn't arrogance. It was something else. Something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Outside, Karoline walked alone through a swarm of reporters. Are you planning to plead guilty, Ms. Leavitt? Do you regret leaking the files? Why, no lawyer, are you trying to make a political statement? She ignored them all, her pace steady as she crossed the street. Waiting by the curb was a silver sedan. As she opened the door, a voice called from the sidewalk behind her. You're doing better than I thought. Karoline paused. Standing near a lamppost was a tall, elegant woman in her late 40s with glasses and sharp eyes. She wore a camel-colored coat and held a slim black briefcase. Karoline smiled slightly. I was wondering if you'd show. The woman nodded. Didn't think you'd actually go through with this. Karoline motioned toward the car. Want a ride? The woman hesitated, then nodded. Inside the car, the air was quiet. Karoline leaned back. So, what'd you think? Vexler's testimony looked bad, but you handled it. calm, controlled. That's not easy on your first real case. Karoline turned to her. It's not my first real case, Professor. The woman, Clara DuPont, a retired constitutional law professor who taught Karoline at Dartmouth, let out a low whistle. You really are going all in. I have to, Karoline said simply. They want a conviction, not justice. DuPont stared at her for a moment, then pulled out a yellow folder from her briefcase. I pulled some public records. The prosecution's evidence chain has gaps. Wexler's server logs were signed off by an administrator who left the agency 2 weeks before the download. Karoline took the folder and flipped through the papers. Her eyes narrowed. This is good. I'm not joining your defense, DuPont warned. I'm just making sure you don't go down for telling the truth. I don't need a defense, Karoline said. I need a spotlight. DuPont raised an eyebrow. You sure that's not ego talking? Karoline shook her head. No, it's strategy. They're counting on me to fold, to panic, but they've already lost. They just don't know it yet. Back in the federal courthouse, Kravitz leaned against his office window, sipping mineral water and scanning headlines. The press was painting Karoline as reckless, unhinged. Former press secretary crumbles without counsel. It was exactly what he wanted. The narrative was locked. You see the way she froze when Wexler brought up the server logs? He said to his deputy. By Friday, we'll have a conviction. The next morning, courtroom 12B filled faster than usual. More press, more observers. People were beginning to sense something. Karoline sat alone again. But this time, something was different. Even Hallbridge noticed. There was something in her eyes. And as Kravitz strutted to the podium, unaware his own narrative was starting to fray, Karoline quietly flipped to the next tab in her notebook. Karoline didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her eyes stayed fixed on the front of the courtroom, on the empty witness chair that would soon be filled. She quietly flipped her notebook to a red tab labeled Witness Number 2, her pen poised, her fingers still. Judge Hallbridge entered through the side door, her robe flowing behind her like a cape. She looked at Karoline longer than usual before seating herself. Let's proceed, she said, banging the gavel once. Kravitz stood. The government calls Special Agent Miles Durham to the stand. There was a pause before Durham entered, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, with a jawline like a cinder block and a haircut that screamed federal protocol. He walked with purpose, the kind of purpose that says, I don't get rattled. After being sworn in, Durham took the stand and adjusted the microphone. Kravitz stepped forward, smiling as if this were a slam dunk. Agent Durham, please state your credentials for the court. I've been with the Federal Intelligence Bureau for 17 years, Counterintelligence Division. My current focus is internal leak investigations. And you were the lead investigator on the Leavitt case? I was. And in your expert opinion, was the classified material released by Ms. Leavitt obtained illegally? Yes. The materials in question were downloaded without proper authorization from a restricted server. And that server, who had access to it? Only individuals with Level 6 clearance. Ms. Leavitt did not have that clearance at the time. Kravitz looked back at the jury and nodded slowly, letting the implication marinate. Then he turned back to Durham. Do you believe Ms. Leavitt had help from someone inside? It's a possibility, but the logs show her credentials were used, no signs of outside manipulation. Kravitz folded his hands. No further questions, Your Honor. He sat, looking satisfied. Judge Hallbridge turned to Karoline. Ms. Leavitt, your witness. Karoline stood without haste. She picked up her pen, walked forward with her notebook, and stopped just short of the witness box. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she flipped to a fresh page, clicked her pen, and looked at Agent Durham like a student watching a teacher try to fake their way through a lecture. Agent Durham, she said softly, When was your report on this case finalized? 2 weeks before the indictment, he replied. And that was February 6th? Yes, she nodded. And you stated that I did not have level 6 clearance? That's correct. Karoline turned back toward the judge. Permission to enter Exhibit 14 into the record? Go ahead, Halbridge said, eyes narrowing. Karoline handed a folder to the clerk. It was a document with a government seal. Halbridge flipped through it as Karoline turned back to Durham. This is a clearance authorization form signed by Deputy Director Cynthia Welch, dated January 17th, granting me level 6 access for a 2-week window to prepare a crisis briefing. Would you like to take a look, Agent Durham? Durham hesitated. That form isn't part of our case file. Karoline didn't blink. No, it was redacted from the original discovery materials. There was a sharp shift in the air. Halbridge raised her eyebrows. Ms. Leavitt, she said slowly, are you saying the government failed to include this document in its disclosures? Karoline kept her voice measured. I'm saying they had it, and chose not to disclose it. Kravitz stood abruptly. Your Honor, I have no knowledge of this document. If it exists, it must have been processed in error. Sit down, Mr. Kravitz, the judge said flatly. Karoline turned back to Durham. Tell me, Agent, do you routinely sign off on investigative reports without confirming whether your subject had legal access to the materials involved? No, Durham said tightly. Then how do you explain this oversight? There was silence. Durham looked at Kravitz, but Karoline cut in before he could answer. You don't need to explain, she said, voice sharpening. Because we both know it wasn't oversight, it was omission. She walked back to her table, the quiet echo of her footsteps the only sound in the room. Durham shifted uncomfortably in the witness box. Kravitz was frozen. Judge Halbridge stared at the clearance form, her lips pressed into a line so thin it could slice steel. For the first time since the trial began, Karoline Leavitt wasn't a former press secretary on the defensive. She was the one asking the questions. And the courtroom was finally beginning to realize it. The courtroom was no longer amused. Judge Halbridge didn't say anything at first. She just stared down at Exhibit 14, her fingers tapping a slow, deliberate rhythm on the bench. Court will recess for 20 minutes, she finally said, voice taut. Mr. Kravitz, I suggest you use the time to review your discovery file thoroughly. The gavel came down like a warning shot this time, not a formality. The gallery buzzed with whispers as people filed out, reporters huddled by the back wall, texting feverishly, already racing to be the first to publish. Courtroom 12B, once a stage for Karoline's humiliation, had shifted into something else entirely. Outside in the hallway, Kravitz stormed toward a bench near the water fountain, dragging his deputy prosecutor with him. How the hell did that form get in? He hissed. We didn't see it in the chain of custody. You're telling me we brought a federal agent to testify about unauthorized access without double-checking her clearance log? It wasn't in our packet, the deputy insisted. The digital clearance logs must have been updated retroactively. Or, Kravitz cut him off. Get Durham back, quietly. And if there's anything else in our blind spot, I want to know now. Meanwhile, Karoline stood by the far window, looking down at the city without speaking. From behind her, a quiet voice broke the silence. You just cracked their foundation. Karoline turned. Clara DuPont had reappeared, somehow slipping past security and protocol. She wasn't supposed to be there, but Karoline didn't look surprised. They stood in silence for a moment, two women on different sides of a battlefield, one retired from war, the other just entering it. You gave them a puzzle they didn't know existed, DuPont said quietly. They've been building a case around the wrong question. Karoline nodded. Because I let them. You understand, DuPont said carefully. "They're going to hit back harder now. You embarrassed them." "I didn't embarrass them," Karoline replied. "The truth did." DuPont studied her for a long moment. Then she offered something unexpected. "There's a file I want you to see. A case from '03. Government sealed it tight. The structure looks familiar. Same pattern. Omitted evidence. Overcharged defendant. You might find some inspiration." Karoline didn't answer immediately. She just reached into her bag and handed DuPont a folded note. "I already pulled it," she said. "Last week." DuPont opened it. Her brow lifted. "Of course you did," she murmured. Back inside the courtroom, Judge Halbridge had returned before anyone else. She sat alone, staring out at the empty gallery, the benches now stripped of their usual murmur and movement. At exactly 20 minutes, she gavelled the room back into session. Karoline returned to her seat, composed as ever. Kravitz entered a few moments later, no longer smiling. He moved like a man trying to outrun the inevitability he'd once been certain belonged to her. "Mr. Kravitz," Judge Halbridge said, glancing over her glasses, "would the government like to address the issue of the missing clearance authorization?" "We're reviewing the chain of evidence, Your Honor," Kravitz replied tightly. "But the prosecution maintains that the defendant's use of that clearance still violated internal policy." Karoline stood immediately. "With respect, Your Honor, I request that the court require the government to specify exactly which policy I allegedly violated, because their indictment doesn't cite any." Kravitz opened his mouth, then closed it. The silence that followed was brutal. Judge Halbridge turned toward the prosecution table slowly, like someone checking whether the fuse had actually lit. "Mr. Kravitz," she said, "can you answer the question?" He hesitated, then flipped through his binder. "We'll need to revisit our filings." "Indeed you will," the judge said sharply. Karoline sat, not triumphant, just steady, quiet, focused, because this wasn't about scoring points. This was about dismantling a lie. One fact at a time. By the time the court adjourned that afternoon, the temperature in the room had changed entirely. The air conditioning seemed to be working overtime, as if the building itself were responding to the tension, trying to cool off something that was beginning to burn too hot. People spoke in hushed tones, moved with caution, like they were navigating a space that might combust at the wrong sound. Karoline gathered her notes with the same unhurried precision she'd maintained since the trial began. No rush, no fluster. She placed each page back into her binder with care, like she was assembling a record she already knew history would one day reference. Kravitz, meanwhile, was hunched at the prosecution table, his sleeves rolled to the forearms now, hair slightly disheveled, his tie crooked. He hadn't looked directly at Karoline since the moment she had asked him to cite the policy they'd accused her of violating, and he couldn't. Judge Halbridge had not rebuked him. She hadn't needed to. The silence had done that for her. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was larger than the day before. Not just press anymore. There were students, protesters, curious onlookers, people who had started reading between the lines. Karoline kept her head down as she exited the building, but the noise followed her like a tide. "Karoline, do you have anything to say about today's testimony? Is it true the clearance was redacted from discovery? Are you planning to countersue for malicious prosecution?" She didn't answer. She didn't even glance at them. But someone else did. Across the steps, leaning against a pillar with his arms crossed, was Thomas Reddick, the former White House legal advisor who had resigned quietly 6 months ago and vanished from public life. He hadn't been seen in a courtroom since. Until now. He didn't wave. He didn't speak. He just gave a subtle nod. Karoline returned it almost imperceptibly as she stepped into her car. Inside, Clara DuPont was already waiting, flipping through an annotated printout of court transcripts. "Do you know who just walked up the steps behind you?" Clara asked without looking up. "I saw him," Karoline said. "He's not here for me." "Then why is he here at all?" Karoline took a moment before answering. "Because something's waking up. And people like Reddick know how to read a storm before the thunder hits." Clara handed her a folder. "The whistleblower memo you mentioned, the one from October?" Karoline flipped through the pages quickly, scanning. "You got it?" Clara nodded. "A former staffer from the Federal Oversight Committee sent it anonymously. It's real. Internal concerns about classification being used to bury politically inconvenient documents. Your release wasn't just legal, it was necessary." Karoline sighed. "I need that admitted without triggering federal privilege issues." "There's a way," Clara replied, tapping the folder. "If you ask the right questions, the memo authenticates itself through testimony. You don't need to enter it directly. Let them admit it exists." Karoline nodded slowly, calculating. "Then I'll need to call someone from Oversight." "Already lined up. Dr. Malcolm Heller. He's been subpoenaed as a technical witness by the prosecution. They just don't know what he's going to say." Karoline smiled, just slightly. "Then let's give them a day to prepare for the wrong battle." The next morning, courtroom 12B was standing room only. Reporters sat two to a bench. A camera crew from an overseas news outlet was stationed behind the glass. The story had grown legs and begun sprinting. When Karoline entered the courtroom, even Judge Hallbridge seemed to pause. She didn't look tired. She didn't look pressured. She looked ready. Kravitz stood and adjusted his collar. He looked back at his team, and for the first time, the youngest associate among them, the one who had been nodding enthusiastically on day one, now kept her gaze low, typing quietly, like she no longer wanted to be seen. Hallbridge banged the gavel. "Let's proceed. Mr. Kravitz, your next witness." "We call Dr. Malcolm Heller, Your Honor." A wiry man in his 60s with clear glasses and a nervous energy shuffled into the room. He took the oath, then sat with hands folded tightly in front of him. Kravitz cleared his throat. "Dr. Heller, you are the Director of Systems Integrity for the Federal Oversight Committee, correct?" "I am." "And you were tasked with reviewing the server infrastructure at the Department of Communications?" "Yes." "Can you confirm that the server in question, the one from which Ms. Leavitt allegedly accessed files, was secured and access restricted?" "Yes, it was secure." Kravitz smiled faintly. "And to your knowledge, did Ms. Leavitt have administrative clearance to override or alter any data on that server?" Heller paused. His eyes flicked just briefly to Karoline, then back to Kravitz. "No." Karoline rose. "Dr. Heller, how long have you been with the Federal Oversight Committee?" 22 years. "And you're aware of the October memo circulated internally about potential misuse of classification to shield politically damaging material?" Kravitz jumped. "Objection, Your Honor. Relevance." Karoline didn't flinch. "Goes to motive and intent, Your Honor." Hallbridge didn't even look up. "Overruled. Continue." Heller nodded slowly. "Yes, I was one of the signatories on that memo." "And in your expert opinion," Karoline said, locking eyes with him, "was the file I released one of the documents improperly classified to conceal political misconduct?" A long beat. Then Heller answered, "Yes, it was." The courtroom didn't erupt, but it shifted. The silence afterward wasn't stunned. It was stunned stillness, as if the air had just been vacuumed out of the room. Karoline turned to the judge. "I have no further questions." And for the first time since this trial began, Judge Miriam Hallbridge looked not amused, but shaken. The stillness in the courtroom lingered longer than usual, as though no one wanted to be the first to move. Dr. Heller stepped down from the stand, his face pale but resolute. He didn't look at the prosecution as he passed. He didn't need to. Kravitz, normally quick to rise and redirect the momentum, didn't even flinch. His hand remained on the edge of the table, frozen mid-scribble. His legal pad sat untouched before him. Half a page of notes scribbled in a rush, now rendered useless by a single word. Yes. Judge Halbridge leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled against her chin. She hadn't looked at Karoline since the moment she asked the question, but her silence spoke volumes. It wasn't outrage or disbelief. It was something heavier, recognition. Something wasn't adding up, and now everyone knew it. "Court will break for lunch," she said finally. "We'll reconvene at 1:00 p.m. The gavel echoed once, but the sound didn't have the finality it usually did. It was more like punctuation on a sentence that had suddenly changed direction. As the courtroom emptied, Karoline remained in her seat. No expression, no celebration, just stillness. Clara DuPont was waiting for her outside the courtroom doors, arms folded across her chest, face unreadable. "That was surgical," she said as Karoline approached. "It was overdue," Karoline replied. They walked in step, weaving through reporters and flashing cameras. No words exchanged. They didn't need to say anything. 20 minutes later, they sat in the corner booth of a nearly empty cafe 2 blocks from the courthouse. Karoline sipped black coffee while Clara reviewed something on her tablet. "They're bleeding," Clara said without looking up. "They're hiding the wound," Karoline corrected. "Kravitz is too disciplined to show panic." "That may be," Clara admitted, "but the prosecution just lost the foundation of their case. You've already proven you had the clearance. Now you've shown the material was classified under questionable conditions. If the jury's paying attention, it's over." Karoline shook her head. "It's not over. Not until someone admits why this case exists in the first place. Someone had to sign off on the indictment. Someone saw the memo and moved forward anyway." Clara looked up slowly. "You're not stopping with exoneration, are you?" Karoline looked her in the eye. "I didn't come here to be cleared. I came here to expose what they tried to bury." Clara leaned back, folding her arms. "Then you're going to need to burn the safety net." Karoline didn't hesitate. "Already did." Back at the courthouse, Kravitz stood with his deputy in a narrow conference room, the door shut, the blinds drawn. The assistant was pale, sweat beading at his hairline. "You told me she didn't have the memo," Kravitz snapped. "She didn't. Not the original." "She didn't need the original," Kravitz hissed. "She walked Heller right into it and let him testify to it under oath. Now it's part of the record. And we can't strike it without looking like we're hiding something." His deputy said nothing. "We've been playing defense since day 2, Kravitz said, pacing now. "And I'm starting to think she planned it that way." That thought unsettled him more than anything else. Karoline Leavitt hadn't just embarrassed them. She had controlled the flow of information from the moment she walked into that courtroom alone, wearing a second-hand blazer and carrying a spiral-bound notebook like it was a scalpel. And she had been cutting ever since. At 1:00 p.m., courtroom 12B filled once again. The air was tight now, electric with anticipation. Even the jurors, who had remained largely neutral through most of the proceedings, were now leaning forward slightly, hands clasped, eyes alert. They weren't bored anymore. They were watching a mystery unravel in real time. Judge Halbridge entered and took her seat. No preamble this time. "Ms. Leavitt, do you wish to call another witness?" Karoline stood. "Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to recall Special Agent Miles Durham to the stand." A flicker passed through Kravitz's expression. Surprise? Annoyance? Fear? It was hard to say. Durham entered again, slower this time, less confident. He took the oath for a second time and sat with his hands folded tightly in front of him. Karoline stepped forward. "Agent Durham," she began, her voice clear, "during your previous testimony, you stated that no signs of external manipulation or credential sharing were found in the digital access logs. Is that correct?" "Yes," Durham replied cautiously. "And you also testified that my credentials were used to access the classified server material." "That's right." Karoline pulled a printout from her binder and handed it to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. "This is a copy of the server audit log from January 20th, the date the file in question was accessed. Would you read the highlighted entry, please?" Durham squinted. "It says the credentials were used from an external IP address assigned to the DC Press Annex building." Karoline nodded. "And where was I that day, Agent Durham?" Durham hesitated. Karoline held up her phone. "Would you like to see the press schedule?" "I was on camera at the White House at the exact time my credentials were allegedly used." A silence spread across the room like ink. Durham shifted in his seat. "It could have been remote access," he said weakly, "except the press annex doesn't have a secure line to the classified server, which you know." Another silence. Karoline turned to Judge Halbridge. "Your Honor, I respectfully request a full forensic audit of the access logs by an independent expert. If we're going to talk about unauthorized access, let's find out who really used my credentials that day." Kravitz stood, nearly knocking over his chair. "Objection, Your Honor. This is speculative." But Judge Halbridge raised a hand. "Sit down, Mr. Kravitz." She turned back to Karoline. "Request granted." Karoline nodded, returning to her seat with the same calm, quiet resolve. And for the first time since the trial began, Kravitz looked genuinely afraid. Because now the question wasn't whether Karoline had done something wrong. The question was, who had framed her? The courtroom adjourned in a storm of whispers. Not loud, not chaotic, just low and persistent, like the hum of an oncoming tremor no one could quite name. Judge Halbridge left the bench with a tight jaw and tired eyes. She hadn't said much after granting Karoline's request for a forensic audit. She hadn't needed to. Her silence wasn't indifference. It was weight. The kind of silence that comes from realizing you've been looking at the wrong suspect. Karoline remained in her seat, unmoved by the sudden buzz in the gallery, unmoved by Kravitz's brisk exit and the frantic swirl of his aides. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes, not from fatigue, but from control. Timing mattered now more than ever. The noose wasn't around her neck. It was somewhere else in the room. All she had to do was wait for it to tighten. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown again. Some held signs, "Truth isn't treason. Let whistleblowers speak," while others simply stood, eyes trained on the entrance, hoping to see the woman who had gone from accused to unexpected crusader in under a week. Karoline exited with Clara beside her. The flash of cameras hit like strobe lights, but she didn't flinch. Not even when someone yelled, "Karoline, did someone inside the administration set you up?" She kept walking. Inside the car, Clara turned to her. "You just requested a digital autopsy on the government's star evidence." Karoline nodded. "And they didn't object soon enough." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Kravitz is losing his footing." "He's losing something more than that," Karoline said. "He's losing control of the narrative." They drove in silence for a block. Then Clara reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder, setting it gently in Karoline's lap. "What is it?" Karoline asked. "Something I didn't plan on sharing," Clara said. "But now it's relevant." Karoline opened the folder. Inside were emails, dozens of them, dated just days before the indictment. Subject lines that made her throat tighten. Filing pressure from upstairs. Leavitt memo, expedited timeline. One email stood out. It was from Daniel Kravitz to Jonathan Clyde. The subject read, "Finalizing the charge sheet." Karoline read the body twice, then a third time. It wasn't just pressure, it was coordination. Language that danced just barely on the edge of legality. References to containment and optics. No mention of the memo's truth, just concern about its exposure. "They buried this?" Karoline asked quietly. "They buried you," Clara said, "and now you have a spade." Karoline leaned back, staring out the window. The city passed by in blurs of gray and glass. People walking to jobs, sipping coffee, checking their phones. Oblivious to the war happening in courtroom 12B. Or maybe not. Maybe they knew something was happening. Maybe that's why they were beginning to show up outside, holding signs, waiting in the cold. "I'll introduce it after the audit," Karoline said at last. "If the logs show the breach, this connects the motive." "And if the logs don't show the breach?" Clara asked. "They will," Karoline said, her voice low, "because I didn't lie." Which means someone else did. That night, Karoline stayed in the temporary apartment she'd been renting since the trial began. A sparse, one-bedroom unit 5 blocks from the courthouse. No decorations, no distractions. Just a stack of binders on the kitchen table and a kettle that never quite reached a full boil. She stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the lights of the city flicker like scattered thoughts. Somewhere below, a car horn blared. A siren passed. Life continued. And in a way, so did she. She thought of the moment she decided not to hire a lawyer. The pressure, the disbelief, the phone calls from former colleagues warning her she'd lose everything. The next morning, Judge Hallbridge opened the session with a weariness she couldn't quite mask. "We've received notice that the independent forensic audit requested by the defense is already underway," she announced. "Pending results, we'll proceed with remaining witness testimony." Kravitz stood, visibly tense. "Your Honor, the government calls Deputy Director Jonathan Clyde to the stand." It was a bold move. Clyde wasn't just a government official, he was the very person who had signed off on her indictment. Bringing him to the stand meant one thing. Kravitz was trying to seal the door she'd just started to pry open. Clyde entered in a sleek black suit and crimson tie, posture military straight. He took the oath, then sat with both hands on the table, palms down like he owned the bench he was sitting behind. Kravitz approached carefully. "Deputy Director Clyde, did you oversee the approval process for the indictment against Ms. Leavitt?" "Yes." "And did you believe, based on the available evidence, that the charges were legally and ethically sound?" "I did." "And to your knowledge, was any external political pressure applied to your decision?" Clyde looked directly at the jury. "No." Karoline stood before Kravitz could continue. "Permission to cross, Your Honor." Hallbridge nodded without a word. Karoline approached the witness stand, quiet, focused. She placed a single sheet of paper on the evidence table. "Deputy Director Clyde," she said, her voice soft, "do you recognize this email?" Clyde glanced at it, but didn't pick it up. "No. It's from your official government account." "I don't recall writing it." Karoline stepped forward. "Would you like me to read it for you?" He hesitated, then nodded. Subject: finalizing the charge sheet. Quote, "The political optics will take care of themselves once we secure an indictment. Her memo dies in court, not in public." Karoline stood frozen for a moment after reading the email aloud, her eyes never leaving Clyde's. The deputy director of the Justice Department, a man known for his unshakable poise and ironclad demeanor, now sat under the fluorescent lights with sweat visibly forming near his temple. Judge Hallbridge hadn't moved. Not even her gavel stirred. She sat still behind the bench, lips tight, her gaze drifting slowly from Karoline to Clyde, then to the document on the evidence table that had just set fire to the floor beneath them all. "I'll ask again," Karoline said, her voice low but deliberate. "Do you deny sending this email?" Clyde cleared his throat. "That document is out of context." Karoline raised her eyebrows. "You're not denying it's yours." "I'm saying," he replied carefully, "that internal deliberations can be misinterpreted without proper background." "And what background would that be, sir?" Karoline asked, taking a single step closer. "That you were coordinating a political takedown of a federal employee who exposed internal corruption? That you used your office to greenlight an indictment not because of what I did, but because of what I revealed?" Kravitz jumped to his feet. "Objection! Argumentative!" "Sustained," Judge Halbridge snapped, but her eyes didn't leave Clyde. "Ms. Leavitt, rephrase." Karoline nodded. "Deputy Director Clyde, did you at any point have a conversation with Mr. Kravitz regarding the political ramifications of this indictment?" Clyde shifted in his seat. "We discussed potential fallout, yes." "Before or after the charges were filed?" "Before." "And did you, in that conversation, express concern that my public credibility could threaten upcoming confirmation hearings for federal nominees?" "Objection!" Kravitz barked again, louder this time. "That's privileged internal deliberation." "Overruled," Halbridge said flatly. "He opened the door when he took the stand." Karoline waited. Clyde blinked. "It may have been mentioned, yes." Whispers rippled through the gallery. Karoline leaned in slightly. "So, to be clear, you admit the decision to prosecute was influenced not just by law, but by political optics?" Clyde stiffened. "I admit that we considered public perception. That doesn't negate the evidence." Karoline turned to the jury. "The same evidence that showed my credentials were used from an off-site IP while I was on national television?" No one spoke. She took one step back and faced Judge Halbridge directly. "I have no further questions." Clyde sat motionless. Kravitz didn't bother trying to rehabilitate him. There was nothing left to save. Halbridge finally spoke, her voice quieter than usual. "Witness may step down." Clyde rose slowly and left the courtroom without looking back. Not at the jury, not at Karoline, not even at Kravitz. The damage was done. By the time court adjourned that afternoon, the press had already begun piecing it together. Terms like selective prosecution, political interference, and fabricated clearance violations were being whispered on cable news tickers and tweeted by congressional staffers with locked accounts. Outside, the crowd was double the size of the day before. People weren't just watching now, they were choosing sides. Karoline moved through the crowd without speaking, but her name moved faster than she could. Some chanted it, others held signs. One teenager with a phone streaming live simply said to his camera, "She's not playing their game, she's changing it." That night, Karoline sat on the floor of her apartment. The trial binder opened on the coffee table, her fingers massaging her temples. She wasn't tired, not really. What she was clear. Clear in a way she hadn't been in weeks. They had tried to break her, and instead, she had forced them to break their silence. Clara DuPont called just after 8 p.m. "You need to see the audit." Karoline pulled her laptop across her lap, logging in as Clara forwarded the encrypted report. It loaded slowly, each line of code and data populating like bricks in a wall she was about to knock down. Remote access confirmed. Credentials used outside of the authorized network. Timestamped to the minute she had been delivering a live press briefing. Data exfiltration logs showing an anomaly traceable to a VPN linked to an internal DC subnet, one assigned to the Office of Federal Communications Oversight. Karoline didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Clara said it for her. "They used your name to get in, then blamed you for opening the door." Karoline's fingers tightened around the laptop. "Send it to the clerk," she said. "File it as supplemental defense evidence. Let's end this." The next morning, Karoline stood at the front of courtroom 12B as the clerk entered the audit into the record. Kravitz looked pale. He didn't object. He didn't move. He simply stared down at the file in front of him, like it had just become a confession. Judge Halbridge scanned the report, her eyes narrowing as she flipped each page. Then she looked up. Not at Karoline. Not at Kravitz. She looked at the jury. And in that moment, everything shifted again. Not because Karoline had proven her innocence, but because the system had proven its own guilt. When Judge Halbridge looked up from the audit report that morning, something in her demeanor had changed. Not visibly, not for the untrained eye. But for those who'd been watching her all week, the difference was there. Gone was the impatient edge that had first greeted Karoline's decision to represent herself. Gone was the quiet amusement, the occasional dry chuckle at a misfiled exhibit or misquoted precedent. What remained was the cold clarity of a woman who'd been asked to referee a fight, only to discover someone had rigged the gloves before the bell ever rang. "Let the record reflect," she said slowly, "that the audit confirms Miss Leavitt's credentials were used by an external party at a time when she was verifiably occupied in a separate federal location. The forensic trail supports unauthorized use, not direct access." She looked at the jury as she said it. Deliberate, clear. The government's theory that Karoline had illegally accessed and leaked classified documents wasn't just crumbling. It had collapsed. The case was no longer a prosecution. It was a warning flare. Kravitz didn't object. Couldn't. He sat perfectly still, his hands clasped before him like a man awaiting sentencing in his own trial. Karoline stood slowly. "Your Honor, I'd like to formally move to dismiss all charges based on the evidence now entered into the record." Judge Halbridge's eyes moved to Kravitz. "Mr. Kravitz?" There was a long pause, then a voice that sounded nothing like the one he'd used during his opening statement. "The government does not oppose the motion." No gasps, no outbursts, just silence, a silence louder than anything that had come before it. Karoline turned to the gallery and locked eyes with Clara, seated in the back row, lips pressed tight. The older woman gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but enough. Judge Halbridge adjusted her robe and reached for her gavel. "The motion to dismiss is granted. Case 24-CR-901 scene is hereby closed." The gavel struck wood with finality, and just like that, it was over. The courtroom did not erupt. It didn't have to. Karoline gathered her things with the same quiet grace she had walked in with on day one. No fist pumps, no smiles for the cameras, no statements. Just a nod to the judge, a glance toward the jury box, and a slow exhale she'd been holding for weeks. As she stepped through the heavy doors and out into the corridor, the sound met her like a wave. Cheering, chants, press microphones jostling for space. She did it. She actually did it. "Ms. Leavitt, do you have a message for your supporters?" "Karoline, what's next for you?" She didn't stop, but she didn't shrink from it either. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, she paused, looked up at the cameras. Then, for the first time, she spoke. "I didn't win today," she said simply. "The truth did." And then she walked away. That night, Karoline sat on the same couch in her one-bedroom apartment, staring out the same window. The city looked different now, not because it had changed, but because she had. A stack of unopened texts lit up her phone. Invitations from political commentators, interview requests, congratulations from allies and enemies alike. Her name was trending in half a dozen countries, but she didn't answer any of them. Instead, she sat with Clara, a quiet cup of tea between them, and the sound of distant sirens humming through the night. Clara broke the silence first. "You know they'll come for you now in a different way." "I know," Karoline said. "They'll rebrand me as dangerous instead of dishonest." "And that doesn't scare you?" Karoline took a sip. "It doesn't matter." Clara tilted her head. "Why not?" Karoline's gaze stayed fixed on the lights outside. "Because the record is public now. Because people saw it happen in real time. And because somewhere in a government office tonight, someone's deleting emails they thought would never be found." Clara smiled faintly. "You always were the best strategist in the room, even when you had no right to be." "I never wanted to win," Karoline said. "I just wanted to be heard." Clara stood to leave. "You were." Karoline nodded, but her eyes didn't move. In courtroom 12B the next day, the seats sat empty. The nameplate with United States v. Leavitt had been taken down. Files were being boxed up. The gallery was quiet. But something lingered in the air, something weighty. The kind of thing you can't see, but you can feel. Like justice, finally, refusing to look away. And in Washington, D.C., in a corner of an office once considered untouchable, a man stared at a printed transcript from the trial, his name highlighted in 4 different places. He reached for the phone, then stopped. Because he realized Karoline Leavitt hadn't just cleared her name. She'd put a target on his. The man behind the mahogany desk didn't move for a long time. The transcript sat in front of him, still warm from the office printer. The last page trembled slightly as the air conditioner hummed above, but the rest was still, like a dead thing that had once pulsed with life. He'd read the words 3 times. Karoline Leavitt's cross-examination of Deputy Director Clyde. The audit results. The dismissal. What haunted him wasn't that she'd won. It was how she'd done it. Surgically, patiently, without spectacle. No grandstanding, no performance. Just facts. Laid bare and undeniable, one after another. Like dominoes falling exactly the way she wanted them to. And now, people were looking for the hand that set them in motion. His name, highlighted 4 times in the official transcript, wasn't a coincidence. He knew it. And more terrifyingly, she did too. He picked up the phone, then stopped again. It was too late for phone calls. The story had left the courtroom. It had gone viral. By morning, Karoline Leavitt's name was plastered across every major news outlet in the country. Even the networks that had once dismissed her as an ambitious mouthpiece were now running banner headlines. Leavitt cleared. DOJ under fire. Political persecution exposed, says former DOJ official. From defendant to whistleblower. The trial that shook Washington. It wasn't just legal. It was cultural now. Cable panels debated it in real time. Hashtags exploded across social media. A new phrase began trending within hours. They tried to bury her, but she grew roots. In her apartment, Karoline sat at the table, the trial binder now closed beside her. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't celebrating. Her phone had vibrated non-stop for hours, but she'd silenced it. What she felt wasn't victory. It was gravity. "You understand what happens now," Clara said, seated across from her with a fresh file already in hand. Karoline nodded. "They'll start spinning it. Say it was an internal miscommunication, a rogue indictment. Try to isolate Kravitz and Clyde." Clara slid the file toward her. "And they'll try to make you the exception, not the example." Karoline opened the folder. It was a list. Names, dates, internal referrals. Past cases where classification had been used not to protect national security, but to suppress dissent. She scanned the first page. 3 of the names she recognized. 2 she didn't. "How many of these were prosecuted?" she asked. "Half," Clara said. "Some quietly dropped. Others forced into plea deals. A few never got the chance. Karoline leaned back in her chair. And how many of them had this? She tapped her trial binder. Clara didn't answer. That night, the doorbell rang for the first time since the trial ended. Karoline stood and walked to the door without hesitation. When she opened it, she found Thomas Reddick standing in the hall, tired, trench coat damp from the rain, briefcase in hand. "May I come in?" he asked. She stepped aside. Reddick walked in slowly, glancing around the sparse apartment with a kind of reverent caution. He didn't sit until she did. "I'm not here on behalf of anyone," he said. "No agency, no party, just me." Karoline nodded. "Good, because I'd tell you to leave otherwise." He gave a soft, exhausted smile. "You broke something open," he said. "Something I thought would never see daylight." Karoline studied him. "You knew about it?" "I helped write the memo that got buried, years ago, when it was just a draft being passed between offices. We warned them, told them what would happen if they politicized classification systems." "And they didn't listen?" "No," Reddick said. "They listened. Then they built systems to do it more efficiently." Karoline leaned forward. "Why are you here, Thomas?" He met her gaze. "Because I want to help you finish what you started." There was no triumph in his voice, no drama, just tired conviction. A man who had once walked away from the fight now asking to rejoin it, not to lead, but to follow. Karoline looked at the folder beside her, at the names, at the lives, and then, finally, she said what had been sitting in her chest for days. "They didn't just try to ruin me. They tried to erase something. The idea that the truth matters more than power." Reddick nodded. "And you reminded them it still does." She stood, walked to the window. The lights of the city stretched out before her. But it wasn't the skyline she saw. It was the next courtroom, the next case, the next name on that list. "This isn't over," she said. "No," Reddick agreed quietly. "It's just begun." And across the city, in offices once untouched, behind doors once locked, people were watching, listening, deleting, running. Because Karoline Leavitt had done the unthinkable. She hadn't just won her case. She had changed the rules. The morning after Thomas Reddick visited her apartment, Karoline woke to silence. No ringing phones, no pounding on the door, no courtroom to walk into. Just quiet, the kind that felt too fragile, too temporary. She sat up in bed slowly, sunlight leaking in through the edges of the curtain like the beginning of something. Not peace, not yet, but the lull between battles. The binder still sat on her kitchen table, unopened since the dismissal. Next to it was the folder Clara had handed her, the one with names, cases, warnings. She stared at it for a long time, then reached for her phone. It had lit up overnight with a dozen new requests. Interviews, panel invites, even a private dinner with the senator who once called her recklessly idealistic. She swiped them all into the trash. This wasn't about applause. It never had been. By noon, she stood inside a small recording studio on the east side of the city, one that didn't belong to a network or a brand or a party. Just a friend. A microphone. A camera. A live stream countdown blinking red on the screen. She didn't wear makeup. She didn't prepare notes. She didn't even sit. She just stood in front of the camera and spoke. "My name is Karoline Leavitt. I was charged with crimes I didn't commit. I stood alone in court for 3 weeks. Not because I wanted to, but because the people I tried to protect didn't show up. So now, I'm going to tell you what they didn't want you to hear." She paused, staring directly into the lens. "There is a network inside our system that has nothing to do with democracy. It crosses party lines. It operates in the shadows of classification, bureaucracy, and silence. And it punishes anyone who tries to turn on the lights. The stream spread faster than anyone predicted. Within hours, it had over 2 million views. By nightfall, Karoline's words were being quoted on news channels and clipped for podcasts. Some called it brave, others called it dangerous. One commentator called it the beginning of something we can't put back in the box. Back at her apartment, she received a secure envelope, unmarked, hand-delivered. Inside were 2 photographs and a single line of text. "We've been watching since DC 8621. Karoline stared at the photos. Both were of her. One outside a federal building, the other in a coffee shop with Clara. Neither had been taken by a civilian. She set them down calmly, burned them in the sink. They were meant to scare her. They didn't. Instead, she picked up her phone and called Reddick. "They're rattled," she said. "Of course they are," he replied. "They've never had to explain themselves before." "I want to file suit," she said. "Not just to clear my name. I want discovery. I want depositions. I want records on the table." "You'll need a team," Reddick said. "I'll build one," Karoline replied. And she did. Over the next week, names began to align with hers, not politicians, not talking heads, but legal minds and former watchdog officials. People who had once played by the rules, only to realize the rules weren't designed to protect the truth. People who had left the system but never stopped believing in what it was supposed to be. Clara DuPont, Thomas Reddick, and a third, Asha Malik, a former tech compliance officer who had turned down a 7-figure NDA and walked away from a contract with the Department of Defense. "We all saw it," Asha said during their first meeting. "We just thought someone else would fix it." "Now we know that someone doesn't exist," Karoline replied. "So, we'll become them." Together, they formed the beginnings of a legal initiative, a nonprofit watchdog group with a single mission: to unearth every case, every prosecution, every internal silencing campaign that had been hidden behind the shield of classified necessity. They called it Clearline. Not a political action committee, not a law firm. A scalpel. In its first 10 days, Clearline received over 400 encrypted submissions from federal employees, former contractors, and investigative journalists. Some were vague, others were chillingly precise. Timelines, server names, requests for urgent protection. Karoline didn't read them all, but she read enough. And late one night, as she sat in the office space they'd rented above an old bookstore, she looked at a post-it note she had stuck to the wall. 4 words. "This is not revenge." Because it wasn't. It was reclamation. Of truth. Of law. Of the voices that had been silenced under the weight of classified ink and closed-door decisions. And somewhere in a windowless room, the same man who had read the trial transcript now watched Clearline's homepage blink onto his private server's radar. He leaned forward. Because Karoline Leavitt hadn't just walked out of court. She'd built a doorway behind her, and others were starting to step through it. The list on the wall kept growing. Each name was written in black marker. First initials, last names, dates beside them. Not all were whistleblowers. Some were victims. Some had been buried quietly, their stories redacted or sealed under layers of legal varnish. But every one of them had something in common. They'd been marked, pressured, removed, silenced. Karoline stood before the list in Clearline's office, arms folded, reading each name as if she were memorizing a litany of losses. The room around her was quiet, too quiet for how much was happening. Clara typed notes on the opposite end of the room. Reddick stood near the coffee maker, staring out the window like he expected someone to be watching from the building across the street. Asha was downstairs, briefing a potential new case. Every floorboard creaked with purpose. Outside, the rain tapped against the windows, a steady rhythm of something ancient and relentless. And somewhere in the city, someone was already drafting the next counter-narrative. But inside this room, Karoline was planning something else. "Where's the folder on Langston?" she asked. Clara looked up. "Bottom drawer, left side, blue tab." Karoline knelt, pulled it out. Langston had been a low-level cybersecurity technician at the Department of Energy, fired, accused of improper access, gagged under a retroactive clearance clause. But 2 weeks ago, he had sent Clearline an encrypted flash drive. Inside were files, audio recordings, emails from internal administrators admitting, quietly, off the record, that Langston's reports had been valid. He'd warned about a foreign breach. They had shut him down instead. Karoline flipped through the pages. "We need to get this in front of someone." "Congress?" Clara asked. Karoline shook her head. "No. They'll bury it in subcommittee and delay until the public forgets." "Press?" Karoline hesitated. "Not yet. We need verification. We need an affidavit. And we need someone willing to stand beside Langston when this goes public." Clara studied her. "You mean you?" "I mean us," Karoline said. "We built Clearline so the truth could speak louder than fear. If I disappear now, it becomes a ghost story." Reddick stepped away from the window. "Then we prepare for backlash." Karoline didn't flinch. Let them try. By the end of the week, Clearline had filed its first official complaint, a 58-page federal disclosure, co-signed by Langston, alleging suppression of internal cybersecurity breach reports, wrongful termination, and unlawful classification of technical documentation. Within hours, government servers were crawling with keyword alerts. Journalists were contacting Clearline without being prompted. A quiet ripple of unease spread through the agencies. Someone had drawn a line in the sand and signed it with a name the Department of Justice wasn't ready to see again. Leavitt. And then came the email, sent from an anonymous address. Subject line, "You're making enemies." No body text. Just a single attachment, a photo. Karoline, leaving her apartment 2 nights ago. Black and white. High resolution. Taken from across the street. A red dot circled her face. Reddick reviewed the metadata. Encrypted. Routed through 7 international servers. Whoever sent this knew what they were doing. Karoline studied the image. Not out of fear, but precision. "This was meant to rattle me," she said. "Did it?" Clara asked. Karoline looked up. "No, it clarified the stakes." She walked to the whiteboard, pulled out the red marker, and under the growing list of names, she added 2 new words. Langston, confirmed. And then, below it, targeted. Asha entered moments later, holding another folder, this one thinner, but no less dangerous. "Department of Interior whistleblower," she said. "She has proof of backdated environmental impact reports connected to offshore drilling contracts." Karoline flipped it open. More emails, a memo, an audio file. She scrolled through the transcript, her eyes catching on a single line. "Classify it. I don't care if it's air quality or uranium. Bury it." Karoline exhaled slowly. "They're not hiding mistakes anymore. They're hiding intent." Reddick nodded grimly. "Then we hit back with the same precision." "And the truth," Clara added. Karoline looked at them all, the small team that had become a quiet revolution, and then back at the board. She remembered standing alone in courtroom 12B, the laughter, the doubt, the judge's smirk, the prosecution's certainty. And now, that courtroom had become a legend. But this office, this moment, was becoming a movement. One name at a time, one truth at a time, one line they couldn't erase. The next name came from inside. It arrived not as a file or a formal complaint, but a knock at the door, soft, almost uncertain. Karoline looked up from the conference table, where a map of agency nodes and known whistleblower connections had been sketched in red marker. Clara, across from her, stiffened. Asha opened the door. On the other side stood a man in his early 50s. With tired eyes and a tremor, he was trying to hide behind his pressed coat and rehearsed calm. He didn't offer a name right away, just a single sentence. "I used to sit in on briefings at Justice." Karoline didn't ask him to elaborate. She simply stepped aside and nodded. "Come in." He didn't sit. He stood near the coat rack, shifting his weight from one foot to the other like the floor might crack open. Clara offered him water. He declined. Asha stayed by the window, just far enough to watch the street without seeming like she was. Finally, he spoke. "My name is Ellis Dawes. I was a senior compliance advisor in the Internal Ethics Division. I reviewed internal communications for impropriety, conflicts of interest, unrecorded lobbying, quiet pressure from external groups. Most of the time, it was small things: reworded memos, leaked drafts, strategically lost emails." He swallowed hard. But then came the Leavitt file. Karoline didn't move. She didn't speak. She let the silence stretch. Ellis continued. "There were conversations that shouldn't have happened, notes that weren't logged. I saw the directive to fast-track your indictment before the clearance review was completed. I flagged it. 3 hours later, my access credentials were revoked." Reddick stood now, slowly. "You were silenced?" "I was reassigned to a research annex in Idaho. No job description, no active files. My emails bounced back. They didn't fire me, they erased me." "And why come forward now?" Karoline asked softly. Ellis reached into his coat pocket and removed a thumb drive. "Because I kept everything. Not the files, they scrubbed those. But the patterns, the login records, the drafts they forgot to wipe. I watched your trial, every night. I thought if she can stand alone in front of all of them and still win, maybe I can stop running." He handed Karoline the drive. "I don't want immunity. I don't want a book deal. I just want to tell the truth before they take the rest of me." Karoline stared at the drive in her palm. It was light, inconspicuous. But what it contained, if real, would be seismic. She looked up. "You came to the right place." That night, Reddick and Asha ran the files in an offline lab they'd set up 2 blocks away, deep beneath a converted print shop that now served as a makeshift data vault. The thumb drive was encrypted, yes, but not well. Ellis hadn't been trying to hide it from professionals. He'd been hiding it from people who assumed he was broken. He wasn't. The files were real. They were raw logs, keystroke captures, edit histories, internal chat records, threads between prosecutors and administrators, between political staffers and department heads. It painted a picture not just of Karoline's case, but of a pattern, a playbook. Identify the threat, reframe the narrative, pre-approve the indictment, erase the context, leak the charges, discredit the subject, again and again the same words. Political optics, control the window, bury the origin. It was the missing link. Clara looked at the screen, her hand covering her mouth. "This isn't negligence. It's architecture." Karoline stood behind her, motionless. "And now we know who built it." They filed the formal petition 2 days later, on behalf of Clearline, on behalf of Ellis Dawes, on behalf of every name written on their wall. A comprehensive request for a federal special counsel investigation into coordinated suppression, retaliatory indictments, and misuse of classified designations for political ends. By Friday morning, the document had been downloaded over 700,000 times. By Monday, a junior staffer in the Office of Government Ethics leaked an internal memo acknowledging receipt and concern. Karoline walked into the office that morning and added Ellis's name to the board. Under it, she wrote 2 words in bold red ink. Unerased. Finally. And just like that, the silence they'd lived under for years began to crack, like the beginning of a storm that no one, not even the ones who built it, could stop. The knock came just after midnight. Karoline had been at the office alone, a blanket draped over her shoulders, the soft blue light of her laptop flickering against the whiteboard wall. She was reviewing a deposition draft for Ellis Dawes, red-penning inconsistencies, cross-checking language. Her eyes were dry. Her coffee had gone cold. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Not when she was this close. The first knock was soft. The second was firmer. Karoline stood, silent for a moment. The office had no exterior signage, no directory listing. Only a handful of people knew where it was. People she trusted. People who didn't knock like that. She slid the bolt slowly, opening the door just enough to see. A woman stood there. Late 30s maybe, dressed plainly, no bag, no coat. Her eyes darted behind her, then back to Karoline. "You don't know me," the woman said. "But you read my report. 2 years ago, the one on foreign aid redirection in the intelligence budget." Karoline's eyes narrowed slightly. She stepped back and opened the door fully. "Come in." The woman entered quickly, glancing once more behind her before the door shut. She didn't sit. She didn't remove her scarf. "I was buried," she said without being asked. "They sent me to a civilian liaison post in North Dakota. No phone, no clearance, no internet access outside internal memos." Karoline's voice was calm. "What changed?" The woman pulled a flash drive from her pocket. "They tried to frame someone else," she said. "Another analyst. This time for leaking the same findings I'd tried to flag. Same numbers, same agency, same rerouted funding, only this time it had already been approved. They needed a fall guy." "What's on it?" "Everything," the woman whispered. "Screenshots, drafts, the unedited procurement logs. I was only able to copy what hadn't been wiped yet." Karoline nodded slowly. "And you want this exposed?" The woman hesitated, her voice catching. "I want this stopped." Karoline finally took the flash drive, holding it lightly. "What's your name?" "I used to be Rachel Vale." Used to be. The way she said it told Karoline everything. Rachel Vale had been erased too. By morning, the flash drive had been authenticated. Not just by Clearline's team, but by 2 independent journalists from separate outlets, both of whom had quietly embedded themselves into Karoline's operation in recent weeks. What Rachel had brought wasn't just another piece of the puzzle. It was the fuse. The redirection of foreign aid hadn't just been hidden. It had been diverted into private security contracts for black sites operating under joint agency coalition fronts, locations that technically didn't exist, yet were funded through public legislation. The rerouted funding had passed quietly through subcommittees, never debated, never read aloud. Signed off by the same handful of officials Karoline had already crossed paths with. And now there was proof. She called Clara, Reddick, Asha, the core, the ones who knew what would happen next. "We're going public," Karoline said. "We're not waiting for a subpoena. We're not waiting for a committee. We release everything." Reddick rubbed his jaw. "They'll call it treason." "They called my trial justice," Karoline replied. "They've never been good with definitions." Asha frowned. "We need protection for Rachel." "I already moved her," Karoline said. "She's in a safe house. We encrypted her identity and her files. If they want to discredit her, they'll have to discredit 10 journalists and 3 federal compliance officers first." Clara looked at her across the table. "Once this goes live, there's no coming back." Karoline's expression didn't shift. "I don't want to go back." That night, Clearline dropped the first set of files. They didn't spin it. They didn't narrate. They didn't add commentary, just raw data. Verified, cross-referenced, time-stamped, shared with every major investigative desk in the country simultaneously. Within 4 hours, Rachel Vale was trending. By dawn, a House Oversight chair had called for an emergency review. A senator, once a proud co-sponsor of the very aid bill used to fund the Shell contracts, issued a statement calling for full transparency. But the real statement was made by the people. Outside government buildings across 6 cities, quiet protests began to form, not with chants, not with flags, but with silence. People stood still, holding copies of the leaked files in their hands. Nothing more. It wasn't about politics. It was about the truth. Karoline stood in Clearline's window, watching it unfold in real time. Reddick came to stand beside her. "You understand," he said quietly. "They're going to come after you harder now." Karoline didn't blink. Then let them. They thought the wave would crash, that Karoline's fire would burn out beneath the weight of legal obstruction, media distortion, and whispered threats sent in unmarked envelopes. That if they threw enough noise at her, investigations, bad faith op-eds, edited footage, they could drown her message in chaos. But they had misjudged something fundamental. Karoline wasn't building a wave, she was building a current, and it was already pulling them under. By week's end, Clearline's whistleblower portal was flooded, not with rumors or conspiracies, but with data. Real, verifiable data. Contract discrepancies, audit log inconsistencies, internal memos from across the federal alphabet. Defense, commerce, treasury, even inside the judiciary. One message stood out. "You don't know me, but you saved my sister. She took a deal 3 years ago. Classified evidence kept her from fighting the charges. I still have her hard drive. It's yours if you want it." She replied with a secure drop link and 2 sentences. "Thank you. We don't just want it. We need it." By Monday, they had the drive. It was everything the message had promised, and more. Redacted communications between internal prosecutors and agency liaisons. Suggested plea offers written before investigations even began. Secret guidelines for leveraging sealed evidence to pressure early deals. It wasn't law. Asha pieced together the metadata while Clara reviewed legal precedent. Reddick stood at the window, arms crossed, watching the city skyline like it might tilt at any second. "This," Asha said finally, "is the blueprint." Karoline nodded once. "Then we release it." Clara hesitated. "There are names in here that sit on the circuit bench, federal judges. And we need to be strategic. We can't give them a reason to bury us in defamation claims." Karoline looked up from her notes. "The truth isn't defamation." Reddick spoke without turning around. "But the process is the punishment, and they know that." Karoline stood, walking slowly to the front of the room, where the board still stretched across the walnut, mez, dates, links, red lines crisscrossing like veins. She tapped 3 names near the top. "Then we use it to our advantage." "How?" Clara asked. "We give them a choice," Karoline said. "Step forward and explain yourselves, or we file a motion demanding an independent inquiry into judicial misconduct, with every piece of evidence we have, filed publicly, not sealed." The room fell quiet. Not out of fear, but respect. It wasn't a gamble. It was a countdown. And she had just started the clock. The next day, Karoline held a press conference, not behind a podium, not in front of the Capitol, on the steps of a local courthouse, one of the very buildings where the suppression had taken place. She stood alone. No suit, no stage, just a file folder in her hand and truth behind her eyes. She began without preamble. We now have irrefutable evidence that elements of our justice system have been manipulated, that prosecutors, judges, and agency officials have colluded to silence whistleblowers, fast-track indictments, and shield corruption under the mask of classification. She raised the folder. These files will be released publicly in the next 72 hours. But today, we're giving those involved an opportunity to step forward, to tell their side, to explain their decisions before we do it for them. Cameras clicked. Reporters leaned forward. This isn't about politics, Karoline continued. It's about principle. And if you think this is going away, you haven't been paying attention. She walked away without taking questions. The footage aired in full on 3 major networks. Uncut, uninterrupted. It was impossible to spin. Clearline's inbox lit up. By midnight, 2 of the names she'd highlighted had released statements through their legal representatives. Carefully worded, full of lawyer speak. But they weren't denials. They were defenses, explanations. And that was enough. Enough to prove Karoline's threat had landed. Enough to tell every agency still hiding secrets. The silence was breaking. The next morning, a congressional subcommittee announced an emergency hearing. The topic: transparency, classification abuse, and the integrity of the federal legal process. Karoline was invited to testify, not as a defendant, as a witness. She stared at the email for a moment, then forwarded it to Clara. Let's give them the one thing they didn't want: a record. Because Karoline hadn't just survived the storm, she had become the weather. And Washington had finally learned. You don't silence the truth. You just make it louder. The marble steps of the Capitol felt colder than Karoline remembered. She stood at the bottom, looking up, not in awe, not in fear, but in absolute, deliberate calm. She had been here before, as a staffer, as a spokesperson, as a silent witness to the games played behind oak doors and velvet curtains. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't here to speak for someone else. This time, she was the storm they'd tried to keep out. Clara walked beside her, a thin binder tucked under one arm. Reddick followed quietly, his coat fluttering slightly in the wind, jaw clenched. Asha stayed back at Clearline, managing comms, triaging leaks, coordinating with whistleblowers. The moment Karoline stepped through those doors, the narrative would shift again, and they all knew it. Inside the hearing chamber, the energy was sharp, tense. Committee members in their usual rows, some pretending to be impartial, others barely hiding their irritation that the spotlight wasn't theirs. Reporters lined the edges of the room, pens poised, cameras live. But Karoline didn't look at them. She looked at the empty chair with the nameplate, K. Leavitt, and she sat in it like it belonged to her, because it did. The chairwoman, a senior congresswoman with 2 decades of practiced patience, cleared her throat. This hearing of the Subcommittee on Legal Oversight and Government Transparency is now in session. Ms. Leavitt, thank you for appearing. Karoline gave a small nod. Thank you for the invitation. Formality, a thin veil over a battlefield. The chairwoman continued. You've submitted a statement and accompanying exhibits. We've reviewed them. We'd like you to elaborate, in your own words, what led to the formation of Clearline and the evidence you've since uncovered. Karoline adjusted the microphone slightly. No notes, no speech, just her. I stood trial for a crime I didn't commit, she began. I was accused of leaking classified material, not because I did, but because I revealed something inconvenient. The room stilled. I represented myself, she continued, because no one else would. And in doing so, I discovered a pattern. Not a mistake, not a one-off. A pattern of coordinated suppression where the law wasn't used to protect justice, but to silence dissent. She paused. No movement, no emotion, just facts. I didn't set out to build Clear Line, but I couldn't walk away knowing what I knew. We created a space where truth could surface without being redacted by fear. And what we've uncovered isn't a theory. It's documented, verified, repeated. Karoline placed a single sheet on the table and slid it forward. This is a sample of what we've collected. Internal memos instructing prosecutors to pre-approve indictments before investigations. Judges influencing plea deals behind closed doors. Classified designations used not to protect national security, but to bury corruption. The congressman to her left leaned forward, his tone sharp. Ms. Leavitt, you're accusing members of the judiciary and executive branch of weaponizing the law. That's a serious charge. Are you prepared to name names? Karoline met his eyes, unflinching. I already have. She gestured to the binder Clara placed on the table. Everything in there is documented. Redacted only where safety demanded it, but every line is supported. Every claim can be traced. I didn't come here to speculate. I came to testify. The room tensed. A few committee members shifted. Some whispered to aides. But the chairwoman raised her hand. Let her continue. Karoline looked out at the room. At the place that had once dismissed her as a naive staffer with too much conviction and not enough restraint. At the place that had let her fall alone into a legal furnace and now called her back because the smoke was rising too high to ignore. I've been called many things since my trial, she said. An opportunist, a traitor, a threat to the institutions I used to defend. But the only thing I've ever tried to threaten is silence. The room was stone still now. I don't believe in dismantling institutions. I believe in restoring them. But that can't happen if we keep pretending that corruption is an accident. It's not. It's a design. And as long as we keep letting the architects hide behind national security and procedural technicalities, we are complicit. She leaned slightly forward. I'm not asking for apologies. I'm asking for accountability. Outside, crowds had formed. They didn't chant. They didn't shout. They held copies of the reports Karoline had released. Printed, highlighted, stapled. Ordinary people reading extraordinary truths. No movement, no noise, just presence. When the hearing adjourned, the chairwoman didn't shake Karoline's hand, but she nodded. Respect, hard-earned. As Karoline walked out of the chamber, the press surged forward. Microphones, lights, flashes. But she didn't stop. She didn't need to. The record did it for her. Outside the Capitol, the wind had picked up. Karoline stood at the top of the marble steps, her hands in her coat pockets, watching as the crowds below parted. Not because they were being told to move, but because they saw something coming. Something bigger than a headline. Bigger than a courtroom victory. Bigger even than her. They saw the truth, and it didn't flinch anymore. Behind her, reporters shouted questions. Karoline, what's next for Clear Line? Are you calling for resignations? Do you think this will lead to prosecutions? She didn't answer, not out of defiance, but because the answers weren't words anymore. They were actions. They were already happening, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop them. In offices across Washington, inboxes were being scrubbed, encrypted group chats deleted, old favors called in, and in more than a few corner rooms, the people who once laughed at the idea of accountability now sat alone, staring at their reflections and wondering which of their emails was in her binder. Karoline walked down the steps slowly, calmly, as if time had finally caught up to her pace. At the bottom, she found Clara waiting, phone in one hand, a quiet look of vindication in the other. Reddick stood beside her, arms crossed, gaze steady. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Asha had already called from the office. More files had come in. A new whistleblower from the National Archives. Another thread, another page, another layer of the rot peeling back under the weight of sunlight. They weren't slowing down, because this wasn't the end. This was the line in the sand. The storm they tried to bury had grown roots, and now it was a forest, tall, unafraid, and spreading. Karoline Leavitt had been tried, mocked, and nearly destroyed. But she stood taller now than the walls built to silence her. Not because she shouted louder, but because she listened longer. She waited. She endured. And when the time came, she turned their own weapons into mirrors, so they could see exactly what they'd become. The truth doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it comes with silence. And a woman who walks out of the fire without looking back. Thank you for watching. I'm curious. Where are you tuning in from today? Drop your city in the comments below. And if this story inspired you, hit that like button to help others find it too. For more powerful, true-to-life stories like this, click the video on your screen now. Until next time, speak the truth, even when your voice shakes.